Okay, well, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome. If it is your first time here, welcome to our write-in. And for those of you who I have not met yet, my name is Haley. I'm the head of education and community here at ProWritingAid. And our write-ins are really fun. They are not necessarily a teaching opportunity, though I will do a tiny bit of teaching at the beginning. But this is really an opportunity for us to just kind of get together and work on prompts related to a specific topic. So today we're focusing on Act 2 of our story. So we'll do a little bit of learning up front about Act 2, and then we'll just have a sequence of prompts where we will work on things related to Act 2 of our stories. And as always, during this section, you'll have an opportunity to work on the prompt and then share in the comments section, and I'll give you some more instructions on that as we get closer to it. But let's just go ahead and dive into what Act 2 is. So Act 2 gives people a lot of trouble. If you have heard me talk about writing before, you probably have heard me say how hard Act 2 is for me. Does anyone else really struggle with Act 2, or is that just me? I'm curious to hear. You can just tell me in the chat. I'll be very jealous if no one else struggles with Act 2. Oh, yep. Hard to make sure you're heading toward the ending in a logical way. Yep. Difficult. Someone's just starting Act 2. Yes, it's often where most of the cutting and editing will happen. For me, it's really hard to figure out how. I usually have a good idea of where the story is starting and where it's ending. But Act 2 is challenging because there's so much that happens there. And it's really, I think, where you kind of make or break the story, right? A lot of stories can have really great beginnings and a lot of stories can have really good endings. But just like someone's saying in the chat, the pacing of Act 2 can really make or break the story. And if I tend to go back and read stories where I love the Act 2. If I just like the beginning or just like the end, I won't necessarily return or just love the book. But if Act 2 grips me, then that's just so great, right? A good Act 2 is so good. And a good Act 2 is so effective. And I think one of the reasons so many of us struggle with this is because Act 2 is the largest part of our story. So it typically encompasses about 50% of the overall narrative, especially if you're thinking about a 3-act structure where Act 1 and Act 3 are about 25%, Act 2 is about 50%. So there's a lot that happens here. There's a lot of content that happens, and it can be really challenging to plot and structure. It's super long and it can be winding or ineffective, especially if you're having just a bunch of things that are kind of mushed together. I love what someone's saying in the chat, the muddle in the middle, right? If there's just a lot of things that are smushed together and it's not really clear to your reader how events are progressing or how they relate to the overall story or they just make the reader feel uninvested, then Act 2 can really be where you kind of lose readers. So what should happen in a good Act 2? So an Act 2 should basically be about the emotional journey of your character, even if you are doing, obviously, kind of physical things, right? So even if your character is experiencing and going places and traveling everywhere, it should all kind of tie back to that emotional journey. So you want to give your character or characters a lot of challenges to overcome, because the key to this act is going to be conflict. Without conflict, you're not going to be able to move the story forward. And in Act 2, you should be experiencing conflicts internal or external. They don't always have to be a literal fight, but there should be multiple conflicts of both. Whereas a lot of times in Act 1 or in Act 3, there's just really maybe 1 or 2 conflicts that kind of show up there, right? We've got our inciting incident that's kind of kicking us off into Act 1, or excuse me, into Act 2 from Act 1. So you're really kind of just setting the scene. And there might not be a lot of challenges beyond that kind of initial challenge that moves the character forward. And then in Act 3, you have your kind of final penultimate conflict. Act 2 is going to showcase multiple conflicts, right? Multiple conflicts that can be both and can and should be both internal and external. Another thing that's important to think about with Act 2 is that our conflicts should get progressively more important or progressively more I guess, kind of dangerous to your character, right? Act two, you want to kind of raise the stakes. You want each of those conflicts to become more and more central to your character as you're building towards that climax and towards that act three. So as we're going through act two, again, the action should kind of be rising, right? And so we need to be thinking about how each and every single conflict can raise the stakes of that character. And again, how the conflicts your character experiences ties back to that emotional journey. So one thing that we'll often see in Act Two is that people will just put conflicts because they need to have conflicts without really making it clear how those conflicts relate to your character and the growth they need to experience. So you could have your character, you know, go to a baseball game like we were talking about before, and maybe get a hot dog spilled on them or get in a fight with a fan from another team. But if that's not related to your character's actual journey, it's just kind of happening to happen, right? So everything that we're thinking about in Act Two has to relate to how the characters are growing, right? We can't just have conflict for the sake of having conflicts because we know we have to have it. That conflict needs to relate, again, to the emotional growth of our characters and how they are going to move forward. I'd love to hear in the chat if anyone has some favorite examples of a really strong Act Two and what they like about that, and how the kind of character growth relates to, or excuse me, how the conflict relates to character growth. I'll give an example from one of the books that I use all the time, which is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. In the second act of that book, it's a heist book. And so the first act is a lot about setting up the heist and kind of getting ready to go on to the heist, to like get into the heist. And the second act is like the kind of setup into the heist, like the journey to the place where they're going to, where they are going to enact the heist, and and then the kind of beginning of the heist. And each of the characters, it's a 6 point of view, or I guess that one is technically a 5 point of view book, but each of the characters has conflicts that relate to their own internal struggles. So Kaz, who's like the leader of the gang, really doesn't trust people. And so he has some hard things that happen to him with the characters that he trusts the most and cares about the most, right? And he's having to deal with how to protect them and how to manage their interests versus his own, right? Two of the characters who are kind of like in an enemies to lovers situation have these situations where they keep finding themselves pushed up against each other. And so all of the actions are kind of related to that conflict. So they're kind of on opposing sides of they're in opposing sides of a war. And so one of the scenes that happens is they happen upon a casualty of that war. And so that is a conflict that happens, not just because you know they're happening upon a casualty, it also adds weight to these other characters, right? The same thing happens with Kaz. Every choice he makes is not because and every conflict he gets into is not just there because there's conflict, but the author does a really great job of tying it back to that character's internal journey. So yeah, I'd love to hear if anyone else has any thoughts on an Act Two that they really enjoy. Great Green Mile. Yes, the Green Mile has a great middle. Yeah, for sure. Again, what is the character going towards and from, and then how can we, again, bring that back to the conflict? And so one of the reasons why I like thinking about Six of Crows, which I highly recommend for anybody who hasn't read it, is that the author does a really good job of almost every like passage and every point of view thing has like about like 50% of what's happening is happening in the present. And like a lot of what's happening in any given point of view chapter is explaining the backstory for why that is important. And it's a very, very literal way of showing how this conflict is so important to them and how this conflict is so important to the readers. Let me see if I can find an example of it. Just looking at the chat, someone saying, I'm reminded of the book, A Simple Plan. The plane goes down, men find money in the wreckage, problems arise. Yep. The Magicians by Lev Grossman. Oh, I haven't read that one. They go to the school in the South Pole. Yep. A good scene as well. Let me see if I can just find up an example. Okay, let's see what we can do. Feel free to drop your other examples in there as you're going as well. I have like so many copies of this book behind me, but I can't put those on the screen. Of Silver and Secrets by Sylvia Mercedes. Main character has to team up with the guy she's angry with. I'd love to hear what makes these scenes so good in your minds as I'm trying to find an example of this. Okay, here's an example. Let me put this up here. All right, so I'm going to scroll down to a couple pages. This is a YA fantasy book, but I want to give you a couple quick examples of how what I was talking about happens and how this author does this very literally. So where was it? Okay. So here we have a point of view chapter for one of the characters, and you can see it's kind of starting in the present. The cheers are greeting the main character as he's emerging from this thing. They have some conversations. It's kind of all happening in the present. And then we have a couple more interactions here, a couple more conversation, and then the chapter is going to switch right about here to where it starts to say they would find another crew to walk with. And then it starts here. When he'd officially become a member of the Dregs, he'd been 12 and the gang had been a laughingstock, street kids and washed up, etc. So we kind of go from this point. So we have this, and this is in Act 1, but this happens throughout this book, where basically we'll start off with things that are happening in the present, the action that's happening in the present. And then all of a sudden we switch from exactly what was happening in the present to a reflection on something that happened in the past for that character. And why I bring this up is, again, this is a very literal examination of what we were just talking about. So we have conflict happening here. We have things that are happening, this fight between these two characters. And then immediately the character jumps into a recollection from something in the past where, which brings the conflict to light, right? Gives information about why the character is acting that way in this particular situation. So he has this kind of conflict, this fight with this one other character, and he kind of treats him meanly. And then he immediately goes into the why. Why is he treating them so meanly, right? And throughout the book, the author is kind of doing this dance of, again, almost every single chapter is something happening in the present, and then an extensive passage that goes into why the character is doing this and what in their backstory and what in their kind of internal conflict and what in their internal growth is forcing them to move forward. Now, that is very literal. It's one of the reasons why I like the book so much, but not every book by any means has to do it. But I think that that's a really great thing to study and understand, again, how each of these conflicts relates to the internal growth of every single character. What I think is so smart about that particular book is because there are multiple points of view for each character, it really helps you keep straight and tie in what the conflicts for each of the characters were, who they were before they got here, and then what emotional journey they're on in additional to the physical journey. And this book has a ton of different things happen. It's a heist. There's a million subplots, but it always ties it back to the core of that emotional journey. And that's what's ultimately most important. So again, as we're thinking about Act 2 needs to be about the emotional journey of your character. Physical and literal things are happening to them. And then it also needs to continuously raise the stakes, with each conflict getting progressively more important and more central to your character, right? So every conflict needs to test them a little bit more as it relates to this emotional journey. So you can start off maybe just testing them, maybe testing their physical preparedness for a journey if they're kind of on a literal hero's journey. But then again, it's going to get more and more serious every single time we go forward. So again, the two things to remember about Act 2. First, the conflict needs to relate to the heart of the emotional journey of your character. And second, it needs to continuously raise the stakes, both with like the actual danger that's available, but then also the danger that's available to that emotional center. They have to be feeling like they're going to lose something, and we're not just having conflict just to have conflicts because we know we have to. Okay, so with that being said, let's jump into some writing prompts. So as we get into this, I know it's the first time for a few folks. Each of these prompts, you'll have a timer and some time to write on it, and then you can share what you've written in the chat if you'd like to. If you're going to share in the chat, please select everyone so that everyone can see it. And again, you don't have to share in the chat if you prefer not to. You can also follow along with my prompts, or you can work on something else if you would like to. But we're going to start with prompt 1 by making a list of all of the possible obstacles your main character or characters can encounter in Act 2. These should escalate in severity, and they can be internal or external. So think about, again, all the conflicts, all the obstacles your characters can encounter in Act 2. So we'll start here. You're going to have 5 minutes to make this list, and I'm going to start the timer now. Okay, so that is our first prompt done. So you can tell me in the chat, what's the list of obstacles? I'm very curious to hear what torture your characters through. All right, we've got obstacle 1, he believes he can receive help from a secret organization. Obstacle 2, he learns that he's dead, or at least that's what people in the world believe in. He has to find a new purpose since his past doesn't exist. And obstacle 3, told that he cannot be with the person he's falling in love with because they are from different worlds and different races. So we can definitely see the increasing tension here, right? So we have at the beginning an offer for help, and kind of this initial kind of conflict around the choice of working with a secret organization or not. Their obstacle 2 has like a very significant conflict if the people who he loves, the people who from his past, think that he's dead, right? Now all of a sudden there's a kind of, and again, an initial escalation of the conflict. And then finally, there's this really intense conflict where this relationship that I'm guessing is developing throughout Act 2, right? This person that they're falling in love with, there's a very significant conflict there, right? And so one of the things that can happen in that particular climax is that the person that they're falling in love with, right, throughout Act 2, you're showing how potentially even that person is helping them in the shadow organization. They're helping them deal with with thinking everybody thinks they're dead or something like that. But that person that he's falling in love with is there for them. And then all of a sudden that's ripped out from away from him, right? And so then that conflict really has a significant impact. The obstacles do not need to be resolved within Act 2, especially if they're relating to the internal conflict. A lot of times, if it's an internal conflict, it is not going to be solved until the end. Again, using Six of Crows as an example, it's a heist book, right? So the conflict is the final thing that they're trying to get is like to make away with the thing that they're trying to heist, the thing that they're trying to get. So some of the smaller conflicts leading up to that heist, they might overcome, but each of the characters' internal questions, internal struggles, they are not going to overcome until the end of book 2, maybe. And then also the overall, like they have like almost smaller conflicts where they're trying to like get into the building, or they're trying to break out of the cell or something like that. So those smaller conflicts are resolved in that time, but the overall conflict of like the heist and the thing they're trying to get is not resolved till later. And in general, again, your obstacles do not need to be resolved within Act 2. Typically, if it's a physical obstacle, that will be resolved. Again, using that example of the heist, they might be on the journey to the bigger thing, but like each individual, battle or small thing that they come up against will probably be resolved at that point. And resolved could mean that they're like running away from it, right? They could be running away from it, or, winning the battle or conquering whatever they need to at that point. But particularly internal conflicts are not going to be resolved by the end of Act 2. They'll be resolved towards the climax. So yes, the answer is no. All right, let's see. We've got, okay. Karen's writing a middle grade book with a Mongolian herder who must go through the desert alone by horse to find a doctor for his father. So there's lots of different things that you can struggle with going through the desert. So they could encounter a hostile force, they could struggle against the environment, many, many different scenarios that could happen, and that could increase the tension there. Okay, we've got in Act 2, 3 protagonists. The eldest is the protagonist. He has just discovered his mentor, and the mentor sets of each of the brother to their own task. The youngest has a long journey and what appears to be the hardest, the middle shorter, but most deal with people he dislikes greatly. The eldest first task is learning what his actual role as a pretender to the throne entails, and doesn't require a journey at first, but instead a great deal of learning the truth of his world. Yes, so a lot of times, again, journeys do not always have to be external. They can totally be internal, and uncovering the truth about the worlds that you come up against is so important, and that can be such a great source of conflict. Okay, obstacle 1, the guy she trusted most. A friend talks behind her back. He's a Red Sox fan. She's a Yankees. That is a huge source of conflict. The other woman Her friends are all coupled off and she feels isolated. Her job sucks. And so she quits. And the question is, who can she trust and who truly cares about her? Yeah, definitely. I would definitely say that for the job for the obstacles in this to feel important, we need to be thinking about them throughout. So tying weight to the job, right? So the job can't just be mentioned. And I'm not saying that you're doing this, but just for everyone to think about. For something to feel like it matters in Act Two, we need to do a good job of mentioning beforehand. So this character can't just quit the job out of nowhere if we haven't mentioned the job or why it's important or the struggle that they're feeling there, right? So if they are having conflict at the job, it has to come up several times, and that could be in the conversations that they're having at the game, right? They could be it could be why she's late to dinner with her friends or something like that. But each of these things, it needs to kind of show up. There needs to be a build up of that tension. And so the event doesn't just feel like it's happening out of nowhere. So it feels like it's like, oh, we've heard about this job before. It's clear how this job is messing with her life, or this boss is messing with her life, or it's clear how much this person cares about it before we go to it. All right, so let's move on to our second prompt. Since we have 4, we need to get to it. Okay, so now we're going to go a little bit deeper into each of these obstacles. So for each of the obstacles, I want you to describe how they relate to your main character's internal goal and internal transformation, right? So if we think about our characters starting the question that we were just looking at, who can this character truly trust? I want to answer for each of the obstacles, how does this particular obstacle challenge that overall question the character is fighting with? And does overcoming or losing to that obstacle get your character closer to or farther away from that transformation they need to make? A lot of times in Act 2, you'll go up and down. So they might get a little bit closer to their destination, but then take some steps back, or they might go 3 steps forward and 1 step back. So for prompt 2, look at your obstacles, answer how they relate specifically to your goals. What's the meaning your character is going to derive from that experience? And then also, is it going to get them closer or further from their goal? And that can be an external goal, and it can also be the internal transformation they need to have as a character. So I have a little bit more time for this because it's a harder thing to think about. We have 7 minutes starting now. All right. That is our second prompt. And go ahead and drop your responses into the chat. We've got, should he help the secret organization? The conflict here is that the character needs help, but these are strangers to him. He can't trust them, but the missions are life-threatening. Trusting never came easily, but he doesn't have a choice, right? So here there is a test for this character on whether or not they'll be able to create this bond, this relationship with people that they haven't needed or that they haven't known, and in this situation where they haven't really felt comfortable before. The character here doesn't want to fall in love. It turns out that he had kind of trusted someone. Like, it looks like there's somebody he loved, somebody he trusted, but they're not in the same spell. They're not in the same situation. And the character is figuring out how he can deal with this feeling with somebody who's not going to leave the kind of tribe to be with them. Yeah, that's great. All right, curious to hear what other people have. Give everyone a second to drop it in. Right, so Lauren says the council doesn't want Jareb to seek out Sally. They do so anyway. This shows their reservation to follow his own intuition. Finds himself stranded and embarrassed, has to deal with shame, and discovers that shame is not so bad. So that's kind of that point of moving forward, and learn something about their own discovery of kind of how they're making decisions and what those decisions are. And then he's having to deal with failure. This is a great example of both moving forward and going backwards, right? So we have some movement forward on some certain points. So movement forward, and that the character is discovering some things about himself and about how he makes decisions and what he does to make those decisions. But then the character is also discovering coupled or encountering that kind of fear of failure and figuring out what to do with that after they're used to a life of success. So we have some steps forward and some steps back, right? So the characters, there's those moments of hope that will be resonant with the reader, but there's also moments of frustration and fear and scarcity as well. Great. All right, we've got a couple more prompts. I don't know if we'll have time to go through all of them, but I'll move to our second prompt, or a third prompt rather, so we have some time for that. Okay, our third prompt is to take one of the obstacles that we just went through, the one that seems the most interesting or the one that's speaking to you right now, considering the thought you put into it, and to write the scene for it. So think about, I don't think we're going to have, or we were going to outline and then write, but I don't think we'll have enough time. So I'll change this to 15 minutes instead, and you can either outline or write it depending on what you would like, because I don't think we'll have time to do both. So let me put a 15-minute timer in here. And again, you can either outline or you can write, depending on what you would like. We won't have time to do two 10 minutes. All right, so one of those obstacles that seems really interesting to you, you can outline it, you can write it, or if you've written it already, you can go in and edit it based on what we've talked about so far. So starting now, 15 minutes. All right, that was 15 minutes. We've got some great sections here in the chat. I love how some people are just using the ellipses. That's exactly what I do when I either don't know what to write or want to come back to it later. And then I also do a bunch of things in brackets if I'm not sure of the name of the characters. So great work here, everybody. All right, we have another session starting at 3, so I have to hop off and just now, but thank you all so much for joining. I hope that thinking about Act 2 in this kind of progressive point of progressive challenges related to the internal conflict of your character. And again, how can the obstacles get more and more difficult every time as they both relate to the character, and then also as they relate to the conflicts. So thank you everyone so much. It's been so great to see you. We'll be back next month talking about Act 3. So lots of exciting stuff to go when we talk about the ending of our story. Talk to you all later.